This week's project is a special project. Every summer, my wife and I go over to Prince Edward Island and we spend a week in some cottages in Victoria by the sea called Victoria Cottages. And while I was there, I met a man named Casper who runs the place, and he gave me some wood called Carolina poplar, also referred to just as regular poplar. But he had some large planks there that he gave to me, and I wanted to do something special with those and make some platters which I could give back to him. So please stay tuned for this project and see what I've done with them. This week's project is going to be something I haven't shown before on the channel. I mean, I've done variations of it, but what I'm going to do this week is we're going to do 4 bowl blanks 4 different ways. So I've got 2 larger ones here and 2 smaller ones. The larger one is 17 inches, so that's pushing my limit. I can do 18. And the smaller one is 11. So again, we have 4, and we're going to do them each different ways. And I hope you stay tuned to watch all 4. And you can let me know at the end which one you like the most. Oh, the other thing is they're not very thick, so they are going to be platters as opposed to bowls. They were from planks, and they're 2 inches thick. So 2 inches thick, so I don't have a lot of room. But again, watch till the end and see what I made from these. So I have this platter mounted in my lathe. The first thing I do is I bring my tailstock up and I make a small indentation. This is going to be my center mark, and I'll use this later on as I remount the bowl. It's always useful to know where center is. Since this is the bottom, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut a mortise and a tenon. I typically mount my bowls on a tenon, which is the smaller surface, the smaller ring you see in the center. Then the bigger ring is going to be the actual rim that the base that the bowl will sit on. Here he just flashed on the screen, but I'm switching to my faceplate. This wood is very dry. You can see the shavings coming off. 2 things about them. Number 1, they're flying off and they're hot. So here you also see that I pulled my sleeve up over my hand because those shavings are too hot on my hand. And also the face shield was just protecting me. I always wear eye protection, but in this case the glasses weren't enough, so I switched to a face protector. Here I've got the rim of the first platter done, and I'm just measuring it for thickness to make sure that it's uniformly thick. And then you can also see what's going to be the bowl that's going to be in the center of this. So I'm done with my bowl gouge, and now I'm just using a round nose scraper just to remove any transition points or tool marks from the platter itself, just to give me a better surface before I start sanding. Anything I can do at this point with a scraper is going to save me a lot of time later on in sanding. As it turns out, on this project I had very little sanding to do. I typically start with about 80 grit. Here I'm using sheet paper, and then I transition up to 600 grit. Once that was done, I flipped that platter around, and now I'm doing the same thing. I'm working the rim just to flatten it off. Here I'm using my gouge just to come from the outside in to make sure that I've got a nice parallel surface to the bottom. Once I'm satisfied with that relative thickness, then I switch to my scraper, again just to remove any tool marks. Here I'm just measuring in with my fingers to see, later on with a gauge, to see how deep the bowl underneath is so that I can establish the rim of the inner bowl. With that established and the faceplate removed, I can now start to hog out the material in the center of this platter. And this happens fairly quickly. The bowl gouge will remove a fair bit of material fairly quickly, as you see here. Again, I'm using my thickness gauges. It's very important at this point that I make sure that the bottom of this platter is thick enough. I don't want to go too thin there and actually create a hole in the center. Many turners refer to this as the funnel club. Not that I haven't been already initiated into the funnel club. I have done that, but in this case I want to make sure that that does not happen. Here I'm satisfied again with the depth and the overall shape of it, that it matches the outside. So I've switched to my scraper just to give me a nice smooth surface before I have to start sanding. So there we go. About 35 minutes later, the bowl is done. I say done, it needs another coat of sanding, but it's pretty smooth and it's shaped. I'm pleased with the shape. So this is bowl number 1 complete. We'll just finish sanding it, apply a finish, and then we'll move on to the next 3. So on platter number 2, I'm going to skip a lot of what I've done on this, because in actual fact, this platter is identical in shape as to platter number 1. Again, the difference is going to be in the finish that I apply to it. And then platters 3 and 4 will be different again. For some reason, this bowl platter was not turning is hot, and you can see here I'm hollowing the inside out. The shavings that are coming off aren't hot like the previous one, so that doesn't seem to be an issue. So this is platter number 2. Again, sanded up to 600 grit, and has a beautiful finish. I'm going to go ahead now on this one. I'm going to apply tongue oil. So for that, I just use a clean cloth and rub it in. I'll do 1 coat here on the lathe, and then I will probably do the rest off of the lathe. And this is platter number 3. So we're going to do this one different than the other 2. This one is just going to be a shallow, straight-walled bowl, basically. But because it's so thin, people would, I think, refer to it as a flat platter. It's a little bit out of round right now. I didn't do a great job cutting with a chainsaw, but we can quickly remedy that situation. So usually before I start shaping or turning a bowl, first thing I'll do is I'll just round it up to make sure that I'm round. I don't want to spend a lot of time shaping the bottom until I know the diameter that I'm working with. If you follow my channel regularly, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. You've seen this before, but along with doing 4 different bowls out of the same wood, I'm also going to do 4 different finishes. So for this one, I'm going to do my homemade abrasive paste. So with that, I'm just going to rub in the abrasive paste first. Rub it in a little bit so it doesn't all spin off. And again, if you've been watching, this is about equivalent of sanding it up to about 1,000 grit. So it does give you a nice, smooth finish. And the other thing is you can see it's starting to bring out some of the grain in this in color. Although it is a very white wood, it is poplar, species of poplar, as I mentioned. But as a result, it doesn't have a lot of color, but surprisingly, it's not bad. And again, I'm also getting a lot of chatoyance in this piece. So I think this is the right finish for this piece. So I rub that in, and then what we're going to do is we're going to rub it off. Because this is the abrasive portion, so we don't want to leave any of it behind. So we rub it in, and then we switch to a clean part of the cloth, and we rub it off. I'm going to switch to paper towel, just because on the cloth rag, I can't see if it's clean or not. The rag's not overly clean. What I'm looking for is to see that I've got no more abrasive paste coming off onto my paper towel. And that looks good. Now, we're going to switch to the homemade polish. And that should give it a nice shine. Again, I'll rub it in a bit so it doesn't all spin off. And this this polish is mostly beeswax. Beeswax and mineral oil. If you're interested, I do have a video on how I make this as well. That's turning out to be a beautiful piece of wood. Now with this polish, what you want to do is you want to turn the speed up so that you generate some heat, which will actually melt that wax right into the surface. That's turned out beautiful, and this was the right piece of wood to do this finish with. So the outside is done, with the exception of removing this tenon, which we'll do later. But now I'm going to flip it around and we'll do the inside. So the reason I didn't remove that tenon that you saw a moment ago is because I'm actually using it here, and that's what's holding the bowl, the platter, as I remove the inside. So again, with this platter, it's going to be straight rimmed. As you can see there, I'm going to match that same profile on the inside, just setting the thickness here and then coming straight into the bottom and then flat across the bottom. The outside of the bowl is already finished completely, so I'll just, again, shape the inside to match and then apply the finish on the inside as well. One of the things when you're doing this type of a bowl is platter, you want to make sure that you focus on uniformity. Especially where it's flat, it's going to be very obvious if the inside profile is not matching the outside profile. Here I usually try and keep, just as a general rule, I try and keep my tailstock engaged as long as possible. And here it's really not interfering with me as I'm working the outer edge, of the bowl and then across the bottom. So I can leave that tailstock engaged as long as possible. At this point, I was satisfied with the general shape, so I removed the tailstock and now just remove that centerpiece that remained there in the middle. This is actually probably one of the most difficult spots to work on the bowl, when you remove that, is to make sure that you get it flat. The tendency is to either have a slight hump or a slight dip. The wood doesn't cut very well in the center because in actual fact the speed at the very center is 0. For wood, it didn't look like it had a lot of color or pattern to it. Look at this bowl here. It is just full of chatoyance. I don't know if you can see that as I rotate it, but you see these lines here. It almost looks three-dimensional, and they change as the light catches it, and it just reflects differently. But that's a beautiful piece of wood. It does have some sapwood in it here too that gives it some coloring, but the chatoyance is probably some of the nicest I've ever seen. So that bowl's done. That's platter number 3. So again, here we are on platter number 4. With this one, it's going to be a different shape than the previous one. This one I'm going to try and go from the foot area to the top of the platter, but instead of bowl shaped, which is, steep at the top and then gradually flattening out as it gets to the bottom, I'm going to try and make this one just a straight taper from the foot of the bowl right up to the rim itself. So think of just a straight wall but angled from the foot up to the rim. Now there's not going to be a lot of angle. It's going to be fairly shallow because obviously it's only 2 inches thick. So with that small amount of thickness, there's not a lot of angle, but it's certainly enough that you'll notice it visually. I think now in this shot you can see what I'm talking about. Again, from the foot, which is the outside of that larger circle on the base of the platter, up to the rim, I'm going for a straight angle all the way across. And here in a moment you'll see I'll put a straight edge on that just to make sure that it is straight. I think you saw that there just briefly on the screen. And also when I go to sand it as well, I'll keep a sanding block on it to make sure that I'm straight right from the base to the rim. So for this platter, I'm using Wipe On Poly. I don't know if I've used this on the channel before, but Wipe On Poly is a simple finish to apply. I just clean the surface and then take a little bit of Wipe On Poly, prefer to do multiple coats but thin. Just put a little bit on the rag and then just wipe it on to the wood itself. And I let that sit, and I'll end up putting probably 5 or 6 coats of Wipe On Poly onto this project. And before the last coat, I'll actually buff it with a sanding pad. Here I flipped it around to the inside. The outside is now finished, at least with 1 coat of the Wipe On Poly. The rest I'll do off the lathe. So here, all I'm doing is I flipped it around, and again, I'm just working the inside, and I'm going to make sure that I follow the same profile that I have on the outside. So from the rim down to the center, just a nice gradual taper, and then across the bottom, of course, it'll be flat. I didn't show it, but I did end up doing this process on all 4 platters, and that is to remove the tenon that's on the bottom of each platter. So for that, you can see on the left-hand side in my chuck, I have mounted just a wooden block. And then if you remember, I made that little indent at the very beginning to tell me where center was. So I bring my tailstock up and I put it in that center marker and apply pressure back towards the drive. And it's just friction at this point that keeps it moving. And that's how I remove that tenon. Now, I've gone back to platter number 1 because you may have noticed I didn't mention how I was going to finish this one. I've decided to use fire, and I'm going to burn the rim. Now, I've done this before in my channel, but limited amounts. I've done it on some burls on the edges where the bark has come off, but it's probably the first time that I've done this. It's not for everyone, I understand. And one of the things when you are using fire, number one, I blow my shop down so there's not a lot of sawdust around, which normally there is in my workshop. And also make sure that you go slow. Too much heat, especially on a rim like this, can cause the rim to warp. So I go slow, I stop, let it cool down, do a little bit more, let it cool down. You don't want to do it all in one shot. And the other thing is, you'll notice I've got the inside tape because I don't want any fire down there. In hindsight, what I should have done was probably burn this rim before I cut out the center. That way I wouldn't have had to worry about it. But in all honesty, this wasn't my original plan. Here I just took a wire brush, and that's just to remove any soot. I don't want any excessive buildup. It does texture it a little bit as well, but I didn't wire brush it quite that heavily. And then once I cleaned up the soot, I did go back and even out any spots that seemed a little bit light. Again, let me know in the comments what you think about this and whether or not this is something that you'd like on one of your platters. For the sake of time, I won't show it, but once I'm done this, the whole thing inside and out will have spray lacquer applied. So here we have the 4 platters done 4 different ways, although these 2 are very similar, if not the same. So maybe I can say 3 platters, but finished 4 different ways. So the first platter over here, which I ended up burning the outer rim, and that has a lacquer, spray lacquer applied to it. Platter number 2 has tung oil applied to it. Platter number 3 has my homemade abrasive paste and abrasive polish, and platter number 4 has wipe-on poly. From a ease of application, the tung oil finish is probably the easiest to apply. From a smooth satiny feel, the abrasive paste, which leaves a waxy finish, feels the nicest. And the one that has the most gloss is the wipe-on poly back there. So leave a comment. Let me know what you think. Let me know which finish you think you like the best, which design you like the best, and just overall any comments that you may have. I appreciate it.